Hi everyone, my name is Azniv Libaryan and I am a D3 in the class of 2026B. Today I'll be presenting our research on vitamin D deficiency and glucose in adults with dental caries. I worked on this project in collaboration with my two PIs, Dr. Man Hung and Dr. Amir Mohajeri. I became interested in this topic not only because vitamin D deficiency is so common in the United States, but also because I've personally struggled with low vitamin D and have been on and off high-dose supplementation for years. It made me wonder how vitamin D might influence other areas of health, especially oral health. In this project, we looked at how vitamin D levels and fasting glucose relate to dental caries in adults. What we found is that low vitamin D and elevated fasting glucose are both associated with higher caries risk, suggesting that some shared metabolic and inflammatory pathways between systemic and oral health. I'm excited to walk you through what we found and why these connections matter for dental practice and public health as a whole. And here's a copy of our poster. In the following slides, I will go into a deeper dive of each of the sections on this poster. So dental caries is a common chronic condition amongst U.S. adults and disproportionately affects socioeconomically disadvantaged and racial minority populations. So these disparities overlap with metabolic risk factors including vitamin D deficiency and elevated fasting plasma glucose. Vitamin D deficiency and impaired glycemic control may increase dental caries risk through shared metabolic and inflammatory pathways. Only a few studies have evaluated these factors concurrently in the nationally representative U.S. population, which is why we wanted to study these factors together. A lot of the studies we came across only studied either vitamin D or fasting plasma glucose, so we wanted to see the effects of them both in the same population. As previously mentioned, we are very interested in seeing the shared immune and metabolic pathways in which vitamin D deficiency and hyperglycemia might contribute to oral inflammation, leading to dental caries. So our study is going to explore these associations among serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D, fasting plasma glucose, and dental caries in the United States adults population. So we know that vitamin D is essential for bone health, but growing evidence shows it may also play a role in metabolism, immune function, and even oral health, including development of dental caries. With diabetes and prediabetes affecting nearly half of U.S. adults, identifying modifiable risk factors like vitamin D status is crucial. Since dental caries is also one of the most common chronic diseases in adults, understanding how metabolic health and vitamin D may interact with oral disease is essentially important. Our study explores whether vitamin D status influences plasma fasting glucose in adults with dental caries, and whether these metabolic markers may help explain why certain populations experience higher oral disease burdens. Fasting plasma glucose, or FPG, measures how well our bodies regulate blood sugar. Normal is below 100, prediabetes is 100 to 125, while diabetes is above 126. According to N. Haynes, 38% of adults, which is equivalent to 97.6 million in 2001, had prediabetes. Similarly, 11.6%, which is equal to 38.4 million, have diabetes. Of that 38.4 million, 29.7 million are diagnosed and 8.7 million undiagnosed. Among adults 65 and older, nearly half, about 48.8%, were pre-diabetic, and the disparities were striking. Men have higher prevalence, risk increases with age, as well as 36.7% of Latinas have elevated FPG, and 1/3 of Mexican Americans with prediabetes progress to diabetes within about 2 years. The same demographic groups also experience higher rates of dental caries, which raises the possibility that metabolic dysregulation may contribute to oral disease through shared inflammatory pathways. All of this makes elevated FPG and its potential link to oral disease a pressing public health challenge that requires better intervention, screening, and targeted interventions. To dive a little deeper into the background of vitamin D, we mentioned it as a nutrient, but it's not just a nutrient or a vitamin, it's also a hormone precursor. So research shows that higher vitamin D leads to improved insulin sensitivity. On the other hand, deficiency of vitamin D leads to reduced beta cell function, increased insulin resistance, and greater risk of metabolic syndrome, which is why having a higher intake of vitamin D, magnesium, potassium improves insulin sensitivity in adults. So looking at the factors separately, vitamin D strengthens enamel and mineralization, supports antimicrobial defense, regulates inflammation, and being deficient in vitamin D weakens your enamel and puts you at an increased risk for having a lot of S mutants. Hyperglycemia impairs oral immune function. Having increased salivary glucose will then lead to increased acid production. This reduces salivary flow and buffering and promotes chronic inflammation. So together, if you combine the risks and the effects, deficiency of vitamin D and hyperglycemia have a synergistic risk in oral health and caries risk. So coming from our previous slide where we see there is a synergistic effect, however, existing studies typically examine vitamin D, glucose regulation, and dental caries independently and not in combination. So the joint or synergistic effects of vitamin D deficiency and hyperglycemia on caries risk remain unclear. That is why this was an important topic for us to explore. And there is limited nationally representative evidence evaluating the metabolic oral health pathway linking these factors. So that is why we asked, what is the association with vitamin D status, fasting plasma glucose levels, and dental caries among U.S. adults? We hypothesized that lower vitamin D status is associated with both higher fasting plasma glucose levels and greater prevalence of dental caries amongst U.S. adults. We further hypothesized that these associations are stronger in high-risk groups, including older adults, males, individuals with higher BMI, Hispanic or Latino populations, and those with socioeconomic disadvantages. So our methods and materials included our data source, which was the N. Haynes 2011 to 2018 set, and our measures include our main variables, which was vitamin D and its different levels being normal, insufficient, deficient, or severely deficient, fasting plasma glucose, and dental caries. Covariates included age, sex, race, education, and poverty income ratio. For statistical analysis, we used our continuous variables as well as we did group comparisons using the chi-square for categorical data, the Mann-Whitney and Kruskal-Wallis for group differences, generalized linear regression models to estimate relative risks. Model 1 was unadjusted, while Model 2 adjusted for age, gender, race, ethnicity, education, and poverty income ratio, and our significance was set at p equals less than 0.05. Our results showed patterns in fasting plasma glucose, so U.S. adults had an average fasting glucose close to the prediabetes threshold, higher in adult males and Mexican Americans. For vitamin D deficiency, more than 2/3 of adults had low vitamin D, especially young adults, minorities, and low-income groups. Dental caries impact. Low vitamin D and elevated fasting plasma glucose were both associated with higher dental caries risks. Associations remain significant after adjusting for the covariates. And for metabolic impact, severe vitamin D deficiency strongly increased the risk of higher glucose, up to 6.9 times higher in severely deficient individuals. Table 1 shows vitamin D concentrations in participants aged 20 years and older by race and ethnicity. Here you can see mean fasting glucose by demographic groups. Levels are very close to the prediabetes threshold and notably higher in older adults, men, and Mexican Americans. This chart shows by race and ethnicity, and if you pay attention to the Mexican Americans right there on the left, you will see how they are more deficient than non-Hispanic whites. Table 2 shows the association of vitamin D with plasma fasting glucose in U.S. adults. As you can see, severe vitamin D levels were associated with up to 6.9 times fold higher risk of elevated FPG compared to normal vitamin D status. And Table 3 here shows the difference between males and females, and that males are more at risk than females. So in conclusion, our main finding was that vitamin D deficiency was significantly associated with elevated fasting plasma glucose and increased dental caries risk. These associations supported shared metabolic and inflammatory pathways linking vitamin D status, glycemic regulation, and oral health. Our secondary findings were that vitamin D deficiency and elevated fasting plasma glucose were more common in populations already experiencing oral health disparities, which included younger adults, minorities, and low-income groups. Integrating metabolic risk assessments into dental settings may support earlier detections of systemic disease. Considering vitamin D in clinical practice and public policy may help reduce both metabolic and oral health disparities. Limitations to our study included that there was no data on vitamin D supplementation use, so it was unclear if it was reflected from natural versus supplemental sources of vitamin D. Also, cross-sectional designs have no causal inference. And lastly, NHANES data is generalized to just the US population, so we would love to see if this is the same effects in other countries as well. Strengths of our study include that we used NHANES samples, which is a large nationally representative data set, when we use mostly recent data and articles, and we use a unique integration of vitamin D, glucose, and dental caries to measure this national data set. Lastly, I would like to thank the Clinical Outcomes Research and Education team at Roseman University for their support of this study. Thank you.